I was miserable and I spent the best part of a year losing my mind with depression and not really knowing who I was anymore. When you have a flare, you don't just experience pain, you lose everything around you, your hobbies, your interests, that series of chapters that I spoke about. And I didn't know what to do with myself. And basically, my wife and clinicians and everything, they knew I used to write when I was a kid. It was my way of processing stuff when I was in hospital beds. They eventually got me to start doing that, and then it became a blog, and then it spiraled, and then here we are today. So for me, advocacy is just literally about sharing your story, sharing your lived experiences in a way that makes people realize where improvements can be made. It doesn't need to be anything more blown up than that, although you'd argue I do a lot more than just that sort of basic thing now. But I think anywhere where I can encourage people to share their stories, because I quickly realized there's only so many times I can tell mine, and there's only so much of an impact I can have telling my story.
Hello and welcome to the Good Journeys with Second Mountain podcast, shining a spotlight on inspiring people and their inspired stories. I'm your host, Ben Veal, the founder of Second Mountain Comms, helping good people do good. And joining me today is my very special guest, Joel Nelson from Joel vs. Arthritis. Joel is an award-winning arthritis and psoriasis patient leader, content creator, and lived experience consultant. He's also the founder of The Pain Company, a purpose-driven, ethical clothing brand that exists to raise awareness of chronic pain and illness and give a voice to the millions of people around the world that live with daily pain. On a mission to improve support and advocate for those living with arthritis and autoimmune disease, Joel is an international ambassador for psoriasis, a member of the Health Union Patient Leadership Council, and an international public speaker. As if that wasn't enough, he's also a husband, father, and the host of Joel vs. Arthritis, a podcast, YouTube, and Twitch channel where he talks with guests about the reality of living with chronic illness in a candid, no-filter way. Joel, you have had one heck of a journey so far, and I'm so pleased you're able to join me on the show today. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Thank you for having me. It's an honor.
I think that's got to be one of the wordiest intros I've done so far.
Yeah, I suddenly realised listening to that why I have no free time. I often ask my wife, where does all my time go? No, you just listed all of that, I realised.
How are you fitting it all in?
Well, at the minute, I'm juggling. I think, like a lot of people, a lot of these things started during pandemic and times where we maybe having a bit more time on our hands, and then things snowballed. So I'm very much having to prioritize where I focus my efforts, particularly because I'm often having to remind people that I'm living with the conditions that I'm advocating for as well, which means, I have to sometimes take a time out when needed.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're really open in terms of talking about that, especially on social media. I know you've lived with chronic pain for much of your life. So for anyone that's not familiar with psoriasis, can you first kind of briefly explain what it is, how common it is, and the impact it can have on those who live with it?
Yeah, sure. So my type of arthritis is a subtype of something called juvenile idiopathic arthritis. I had arthritis from the age of 10 years old, and that affected all of my teenage years. And then in my mid 20s, I developed the sort of stereotypical, I suppose, psoriasis rashes. And essentially, it's all one and the same thing. It's all your body attacking itself, an autoimmune condition where basically your immune system overreacts, over responds to sometimes, yeah, it's normally a foreign body. So it might be like an allergy or an infection or a cold or something you get. And I appreciate people understand this a little bit more now post COVID, because people like myself were talked about quite a lot about how the immune system can sort of over respond. But what happens in psoriasis essentially is like a regular person's skin will sort of refresh every sort of 4 weeks. In psoriasis, that whole thing is sped up. It's like on steroids. So my new skin cells will come through sometimes after like 7 days. And then what it does is it kills the top layer. And then that's
Right.
what you see when you see the rashes. It's basically it's a natural process that happens in every single person, but in an autoimmune, complicated person like myself, that happens a lot quicker, and therefore we present with the rashes. And I get a lot of different rashes. People sort of associate psoriasis with the traditional elbow or knee patches, but I get scalp psoriasis. I get something called inverse psoriasis, which tends to be in areas of the body you don't see, like folds of the skin and armpits and things like that. And I also get a particularly nasty one that's called palmoplantar pustulosis, which is like liquid filled blisters on the hands and soles of my feet. So there's lots of layers to psoriasis, but in a nutshell, that's what it is and what I live with.
But on the plus side, it's massively improved your vocabulary.
Yes, yeah, there's lots of words you have to learn. And yeah, they're never easy to say. So feel free to let me do all of those.
So how's that kind of from that diagnosis when you were a lot younger? How's it kind of changed and evolved over years, and how's it affecting you as you're getting a bit older?
Yeah, so the best way I can explain it is that because I got it very young, many of us that do get juvenile idiopathic arthritis, or JIA for short, about 60% of us, 50, 60% people disagree slightly on the numbers, will go on to have arthritis in adulthood. So a lot of us will live initially in hope that we'll grow out of it. And I did for a long while. And then you suddenly get to 18 and things aren't getting a little bit easier. And you start having to sort of accept that reality that it's here for good. And because mine was one that stuck around, in sort of plain English terms, my body continues to find new ways to attack itself. That's probably the easiest way I can explain it. So what started as a problem with like inflammation in my hip and knee went on to be inflammation in my hip, knee, spine, and neck. I've had uveitis, which is inflammation of the eye, which is a really serious thing, which if you don't get to hospital quick enough, it can blind people. I've had liver inflammation. And then when I got to my mid-20s, I got psoriasis. So it's evolved, and I'm led to believe by my consultants and everything that typically people with JIA will stop developing new issues in their mid-40s, which feels ironic to me because that feels like just the right age when you start developing other problems just with getting older. But yeah, I'm basically told it's typical until you're sort of 40s, mid-40s, that you'll stop sort of evolve, the condition will stop evolving. And it can be just the weirdest thing. Like I've developed loads of allergies recently in the last few years that have never been allergies or issues before. And again, it's inflammation. My asthma's been flaring. That's inflammation. It's so unfortunately my immune system is just like wired to overreact. And until I sort of get to that point where your body stops getting exposed to new things, I guess that's probably the point where I can relax a little bit. But like all, degenerative kind of progressive conditions, the older I get, the more complications I get, so I get joint damage and I get more issues with my skin or my eyes or, all this sort of thing. So that part of it kind of sucks because just as you adapt to a new angle to the disease, you start then having to deal with the build up of all the damage over the years as well, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that must be really hard. I mean, how do you kind of mentally keep on top of that? Because I guess every time you feel like you've kind of conquered, I talk a lot about mountains. I guess every time you feel like you've conquered one mountain, another one crops up.
Yeah, you'll hear a lot of people in my position talk about sort of climbing that mountain as a sort of metaphor. And my one that I use a lot is like it's like living a series of chapters, because something like arthritis, psoriasis, a lot of autoimmune conditions, they work via a flare remission cycle. So I've had periods of my life where I've been perfectly fit and healthy and I've played sport and I've played music and done all the things I want to do. And then you will flare and you lose all of that. And what we need to do more, and one of the things I sort of campaign and advocate for, is that sort of multidisciplinary approach to our care and in making sure that mental health is tied into, so for me, rather than just going to see a rheumatologist that gives me pills for inflammation or a dermatologist that gives me a cream for my skin, there should be a bolt on integrated mental health sort of part of that. And it is coming, we're getting there slowly, because what people don't appreciate for people like me is that, I literally went from a rugby playing, long distance running, cycling guy to within 2 months being on crutches with a newborn and not knowing how to care for a newborn because both of my hands were occupied with crutches and I didn't know I needed to really plan for that situation. And then mentally, that's when they're like, all your guilt and all that stuff kicks off, because you're thinking, I've brought life into the world and now I don't feel prepared. So the best way I can explain to anyone who's got no exposure or experience of it is it's like living a series of chapters, and it isn't just about the pain and the inflammation, although that's what you will hear people talk about most associated with something like arthritis or psoriasis. For me, as an advocate and as a person living with it, it's the mental health impact, because I don't know I'm constantly mourning for yesterday and worrying about tomorrow. And then you never get to live in the present, because how can you enjoy today when you don't know how bad your mobility or disability or pain is going to be tomorrow? And also when you're constantly carrying around this luggage of what you had and lost, if that sort of makes sense to anyone that hasn't had that experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was just thinking, I mean, you touched on it earlier, but COVID, and throughout that pandemic, I mean, I think that was the kind of period where a lot of people's eyes were probably open to people who were immunocompromised, and kind of that feeling of kind of having a bit more social responsibility in terms of being really careful with the social distancing. I mean, I imagine during a lot of the pandemic, you had to really keep yourself very isolated, did you?
Yeah, and to be honest, I'm still feeling the effects of it now. So I had to go into that whole shielding program for people in the UK that are familiar with that term. But essentially, we were put on house arrest and we got no warning for it. So whereas everybody else maybe had a couple of months here and there of lockdowns, people will talk about lockdown 1, 2, 3, whatever. For those of us that were considered high risk and immune compromised, and essentially that, just to explain to anyone listening to this or watching it back, the reason for that is in order to treat our condition, we have to dampen down our immune system. So, in order to reduce the rashes and reduce the inflammation and reduce the pain, we take medications that essentially dial down your immune system. But by doing that, it makes us far more prone to infection, which was the huge issue with COVID, because all of a sudden you had a pandemic, a new virus, there was no vaccine for it, and there's millions of people like me that are literally picking up colds and coughs and flus constantly because of our treatment, and it was a really worrying time. So yeah, I got a phone call in the February of 2020 from my nurse at the hospital saying that this thing is coming, you need to start. And at the time, I remember I took the call. I was walking my dog, and I said, "Oh, can I still walk my dog?" She's like, "No, you can't do anything, but I haven't told you this yet." And then I got the letter basically saying from the government that we had to go into shielding. And yeah, from February to the end of August, I never left my house. Never. I went in the back garden and that was it. And I'm not getting the violin out because the whole time I remember thinking there are people in tower blocks in London or somewhere that haven't even got that, So I was really grateful I had a garden and a son. My wife's nursing the NHS, so she would be away all day, exhausted, and she'd have to come in the front door, and I couldn't go near her. She'd have to put everything in the wash, anti-bac absolutely everything she'd touched. And some nights we wouldn't see each other. It's just easier for me to stay in the living room with the door shut and her to go straight upstairs. And she had colleagues that, she was offered as well to stay in a hotel. Like, can you imagine your wife just, but that happened. My wife didn't do that, but there was lots of people that did. And all of a sudden, like I say, I was stuck with an 18-month-old, which, were the most magical days looking back as a parent because of all the development and everything. But all of a sudden, all those plans you had for them, them trips out, those days away, the things you were going to do with them, and he was stuck there and he couldn't go to nursery because if I shielded and my son went to nursery, then there was no point in me shielding because he'd be bringing home absolutely everything
Yeah.
under the sun from nursery. So yeah, so I felt so much guilt for him as well. Not that he remembers any of it, but if you're a parent, you'll understand that.
Well,
that
so my little boy was about the same age as yours
okay,
during the first
yeah,
lockdown. I was torn in the middle. Like, what part of me was like feeling very sad for him that he was missing out on lots of experience, but the other half of me was saying, well, he's got loads and loads of my time, and I'm sure for your son, having a lot of time with you, just playing and having you being around, that stuff. They say we don't remember it, but I'm sure it all sinks in. I'm
oh
sure
yeah,
it's
and
all still there.
even
And
today, he still asks me every night to take him to bed, and I have to explain that some nights Daddy's busy, and if as soon as he's ill or hurts himself, it's running over to me. So there's obviously a lot of that that's ingrained. But yeah, the real challenge I had, and again, the thing that maybe people don't appreciate enough or talk about enough, is everything stopped for people like me. I have multiple hospital appointments a year, multiple treatment things that have to take place in a hospital setting. And obviously, they weren't going to let people like me anywhere near a hospital, not to mention all the staff were busy fighting the COVID effort. So it wasn't just like we were locked in our houses, but all of a sudden we couldn't get access to our drugs, we couldn't get access to our treatments, we couldn't get access to support. Rheumatologists, in particular, were like the first people moved into the COVID sort of fight because trying to understand that immune response and everything else that was happening. So yeah, it was a really scary time to have complete strangers bringing your prescriptions from the chemist to your door. It just all that. It was really surreal, and yeah, the mental scars still hang. Like I still am not comfortable going out socializing. I used to be a very, very sociable person. I'm working through that. But I think, yeah, it's something whenever I talk about this sort of thing, I'll get the usual comments of people saying, it's done, move on, we're living with COVID. And I think for people like me and the people I represent with my advocacy, it's really important that I do keep reminding people what we went through, because that isn't something that gets repaired overnight.
no, absolutely. I think as a society, we're living with a lot of residual trauma from that period. Even if people are saying, "Oh, we've moved on, carry on, life as normal." It's not. Less than 3 years ago, we were not allowed to see one another.
Yeah.
2 years ago, we were terrified, and only 1 year ago it was raging again. So to kind of put it in the past and say, oh, it's just this thing that happened and move on, live life, I think there's a lot of scarring still there. I'm interested about kind of awareness for chronic illness. I mean, for this age group that we're in, this kind of 20 to 30 something age group that we're, well, let's be honest, we're both fast
towards the end of
leaving
that.
But is there a lack of awareness, do you think, when it comes to this younger age group and living with chronic illness? Do you think that's something that people generally just associate much more with older people?
Yeah, I think the 20s group has got better. You saw a big thing during the pandemic of people taking to the likes of Instagram and for the first time talking about their chronic conditions. And there was this huge boom, which was awesome. And it kind of allowed the work that I was doing to just like go on to a whole new level. Unfortunately, that didn't last, like people taking up baking and all the other hobbies that
Banana
people
bread.
do. Yeah, it's a lot of the those accounts sort of came and went and everything else. But I think it created pockets of support for the 20-somethings that weren't sort of there. But I think the people in their 30s and the 40s, they really are like this forgotten bracket with chronic illness, because you have people like me that are diagnosed as a kid and support is thrown at you. Like literally, I'd get admitted to hospital for a month at a time. And it wasn't because I needed to be in hospital. It was literally so I could get like daily physio, daily hydrotherapy, daily access to different trials and drugs and all the various bits and pieces. And then you suddenly get to an adult and you have your first flare. It comes, a lot of chronic conditions as flare remission, whether it's arthritis or Crohn's or something else. And then you go to ask for help and you realize it's not there, or it's not there to the level that you experienced it. And also, I think, like, especially here in the UK, we're talking a lot about the NHS at the minute. It's a system that's built for triage. It's not really a system that's built for long-term healthcare. You break your leg, you go and you get it fixed, you come out. So for people like me, where you have a couple of good years and you suddenly drop off the system, and then it all comes back, trying to get back in that door is a real issue. And I don't think that helps in getting people to talk and share their experiences. And it's why you hear me also talk a lot about sort of like men's mental health and things like that, because I think also from my personal experience, 30s, 40s, it tends to be like a period where people close off. For me, it was like I suddenly had responsibilities and I had to pay the bills, and you got a mortgage and you got to put food on the table for your family. And I think if you're ever going to close off that, it felt to me, my experience anyway, that's when you were going to do it. I think that's the big issue, where we're a little bit unrepresented, because we're not towards the end of needing long-term care because of age or anything. And all the interest has gone from when we were young and interested from having like these old person diseases, which I actually hate that term, but you know what I mean, where you're suddenly you're an interesting case because you're a minor with something that doesn't happen very often. So, just comparing my experiences to people that are newly diagnosed in their 30s and 40s is night and day. And that's what I sort of try and campaign for, these people that are living with this stuff over a really long period of time, that tend to just get forgotten because the system doesn't support long-term health conditions. And it's kind of why I do all my sort of like peer leadership stuff, and I'm trying to get more involved with like NHS, like at a plan and service delivery level, because I think people are kind of missing that. We're focusing on time to diagnosis, and we're focusing on people's quality of life, and then we're forgetting what happens when that fluctuates through somebody's life journey with a chronic illness.
Yeah, so I mean, I know you're a very outspoken and very proud advocate of the psoriatic community, and especially when it comes to patient care and that patient experience. What does advocating mean to you, Joel, and why is it so important?
I think the best way to answer that is to start by saying why I sort of found my voice, if you like, in that, it was before the pandemic, 2019. We'd planned to start a family, and my son was due in January 2019. And we'd planned this with my doctors. I was in a really good place. So I was playing rugby and cycling and running and lovely, fit and healthy. And the same very month that my son arrived, my treatment was changed. And that was the very treatment that had got me to be the person I wanted to be and live the life I wanted to live. And it was nothing but a cost saving measure. It was, and there's never really been anything done about that. There was an NHS initiative to say £5 million for people that are on biologics, switching them over to something called biosimilars. Long and the short of it is the patent had run out on the original treatment, meaning lots of other companies could make the drug and it was cheaper to switch them over. And for lots of people that worked, and the extra money hopefully enabled somebody somewhere else to get the treatment. But for me, it didn't. And it then took 11 months to switch me back, even though when I was consulted on it and I signed the declaration and everything else, I was told it'd be instant. If there was any problems, if I want to switch back, I could switch back. And nowhere did it say it would take me the best part of a year to do that. And by that point, the damage was done. I'd lost my mobility and I had damage and everything else. And long story short is I've been left in permanent pain from that. So the arthritis flare has gone, but I still experience the pain in the joints that were affected at the time. So something to do with, like, brain pain pathways and everything else. So your brain is, it's a bit like how it was explained to me. It's like like an amputee still feeling pain in the missing limb. I still experience that. And I was miserable. And I spent the best part of a year losing my mind with depression and not really knowing who I was anymore, because as I've talked about before, and I've no doubt probably will again, when you have a flare, you don't just experience pain, you lose everything around you, your hobbies, your interests, and that series of chapters that I spoke about. And I didn't know what to do with myself. And basically my wife and some of my clinicians and everything, they knew I used to write when I was a kid, and it was my way of processing stuff when I was in hospital beds, and they eventually got me to start doing that, and then it became a blog, and then it spiraled, and then here we are today. So for me, advocacy is just literally about sharing your story, sharing your lived experiences in a way that makes people realize where improvements can be made. It doesn't need to be anything more blown up than that, although you would argue I do a lot more than just that sort of basic thing now. But I think anywhere where I can encourage people to share their stories, because I quickly realized there's only so many times I can tell mine, and there's only so much of an impact I can have telling my story. So now my priority today is creating platforms and spaces for other people to share theirs, to just keep highlighting what are the pain points for today's patients, because it's fluid. What was my issue in 2019 is somebody else's issue tomorrow. And so it's really important that we keep reviewing what the pain points are in order to make improvements. It feels like a bit of a lost battle at the minute with the state of the NHS in 2023 UK, but that's what we strive for, to basically incorporate lived experience into everything, all of healthcare delivery, not just bits and pieces for a tick box exercise. So yes, that's what brought me here today.
It's amazing, because you've gone from where you were in 2019 to where you are in 2023, and we're recording this not long after you've been on a bit of a tour really of international speaking. I want to touch on that, but the main thing I want to ask you, Joe, is how on earth did a giant painting of your lovely face end up on a very public display in Spain?
Yeah, that's funny that. So yeah, that one did come about because of the whole tour thing, which we can talk about, which was a total accident. But yeah, long story short, I was asked to help with a World Psoriasis Day project, and I get asked to do lots of projects and focus groups, and some of them are quite low key stuff that nobody ever sees, some pharmaceutical company sort of research thing, and then others kind of a lot bigger than you imagine. Now, I initially went into it thinking I was doing like I was being interviewed. Then I said, can you go over to Spain, because we'd also like to paint your picture? And I said, okay, didn't really understand the link. And then so I find myself going all the way to Spain for basically 24 hours. I did go the day before because I've always wanted to go to Barcelona, so I thought it was an opportunity to have a look around. And suddenly I find myself in this studio with professional camera crews and everything, and basically like Netflix style documentary while somebody paints me. And then 2 weeks later, it appeared on the side of a building in Barcelona because the pharmaceutical company plastered their headquarters with this image. And none of that I knew was going to happen. But yeah, it was.
What was your reaction to seeing your face plastered on the side of a building?
Surreal, I must admit. I went through them sort of like that cycle of emotions where like, is this a wind up, or
more importantly,
oh
what was your wife's reaction when she saw your face plastered on the side of a building?
Oh, my wife is it's probably for the best. She's very horizontal when it comes to all this stuff, so she knows when to kick me up the backside when I'm having a bit of I've always had like imposter syndrome with my advocacy, and there'll be times where I can just do like a stream and it's a quiet one or no one turns up, and I'm like, don't know why I bother doing this anymore. It's not having any impact. So she soon kicks into life when I have those moments, but when things go really well, she's also very good at being horizontal and keeping my head level, I think.
Yeah.
So yeah, very, very, very chilled on that one compared to me.
She's like, it doesn't matter if you've got your face plastered on the side of a building in Spain, you're still got to cook dinner and put the kids to bed.
Exactly that, So yeah, she gives the rocket when it's needed, but she doesn't let me get too carried away when we have some bizarre moments like that. And yeah, I still to this day couldn't really tell you why me. There's thousands of people that could have probably done that a lot, but I was very proud of how the video came out and the paint, and yeah, properly it made me cry. So they done like this big like Netflix documentary style reveal thing, you know what I mean? And yeah, I was blubbering away mainly because they'd put my son in it. And as soon as because it was meant to be, it was about the light and dark of psoriasis, and happy to give anyone a link to the video if they ever want to see it. But the whole point of it is like how, again, series of chapters, how, you know, one half the paint is in dark, people walking away from me because I've lost my social circle and my head is bowed and there's tears and that sort of thing. Then the other half is in color, and that's me lifting up my son and playing sports. And it's kind of trying to show how we have to almost live as two people with this fluctuating condition and how it affects your confidence, because you know, psoriasis is very visual. It affects your body confidence and your mental health significantly, you know. So it was an experience, one I never ever would have said I'd get to do.
That's something I was going to ask you about. I mean, we'll kind of come on to the podcast a bit more, but one of the things that I really love about listening to it is that it is very raw, but it's also very celebratory in points, as well as talking about the challenges, obviously, of living with chronic pain. You know, you really enjoy celebrating the achievements of chronically ill people. Like, was that an intentional decision you made from the start to really strike that balance?
Yeah, I think so. Like I've always been good just because of my writing, and I'm a creative guy. So I used to play in bands and things like that. I've always been quite good at playing on people's emotions, but not in like a manipulative way, just in a seed and a thought sort of thing. So a lot of my talks and things I write, I will try and get like an emotional response quite early on, because I think it's really important to get people's attention. You know, we all live in a world with ridiculously short attention spans now. Like, and you only have to see that with YouTube. You put a video on that's 20 minutes compared to something that's 15 seconds, and the view difference is huge. So I'm quite good at sort of like getting to the heart of the issue and really getting people to sort of like try and relate and like shock them into their attention in terms of telling my story. But I also realized that there's like I say, you can do that, but you've also got to explain, like going back to that light and dark thing, why, what we're striving for. And I think a lot of it came from during the pandemic. I kind of got a bit frustrated. I didn't want to be someone's inspiration porn. Do you know what I mean? Because I think,
Yeah.
unfortunately, when people think about disability and chronic illness when they haven't got it themselves, they think of like the Paralympics or people achieving at the very high level. And it's important for me to point out to people that that doesn't have to be at that level. You know, for a single mum with chronic pain, sometimes just getting their kid to nursery that day could be their mountain and their win. And we should celebrate that. You know what I mean? And they should feel good about that, particularly as a parent. I know how much you beat yourself up about the minor things. When I'm in pain, I can't do stuff with my son, or I have to cancel. And the weight of living with chronic illness can crush you. So it's really important to recognize where the wins are. And they don't have to be these huge achievements. They don't, and I often remind people, like, you know, it doesn't have to be speaking in front of a camera on a podcast like I am here today. It could literally just be like I say, getting that kid to nursery so they have a good day when you can't do it. That's okay. That's a win. It doesn't need to be a negative. It can be, you know, for me, I've talked about how I'm trying to come out of the whole pandemic thing, going out with friends and not feeling too self-conscious and that sort of thing. So I think it's just in a world of Instagram and filters and all of that, and you know, it's important to have real life rather than filtered life. And for me, the wins, they vary. They're individual. What's my idea of achievement could be totally different to the next person, and that's okay. And it's kind of trying to create a space where we can have those conversations where people don't feel guilty and they can talk about the really crappy side of living with chronic illness, then also celebrate those small little wins that apply to them, that matter to them.
Yeah, it's all relative. I mean, I think this is a problem with social media, but everything's just so, kind of held on this massive pedestal. And actually, as you say, a small win like that, it can be a big win for someone else. And as soon as we can get past this whole point of comparing ourselves to one another's achievements and just focus on our own achievements, our own lives, the world will be a far happier place for all. You've talked about your son, and I know two very key areas for you that you talk about a lot across your channels are mental health and parenting. I know living with young kids, you know, living with young kids, they don't have an off switch. And from my experience, they're not typically that attuned to how their parents are on the inside. And that's been my experience with my boys anyway. Even when I've tried to do my best to kind of be a dad who's spoken quite openly within the house about anxiety and depression and what it means to have kind of black days. On days when you're feeling in extreme pain, how do you navigate family life whilst also looking after yourself.
Yeah. And I think it's important when I sort of give examples here to say that I've gone through that whole cycle and I'm still learning. And, you
Mm.
know, I've got a good balance now, but in like you go back to 2020 when I was in that situation stuck at home, I felt like the worst parent. I felt like I don't know, I felt irresponsible in a weird way that I didn't plan for my health to get this bad or this situation to get this bad and I couldn't cope. I think life got a lot easier for
I
me.
think to be fair, not to lessen your situation, but I think everyone felt like the worst
Yeah.
parents in
Yeah.
the world during the pandemic.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
none
No
of
doubt.
no, I didn't speak to a single person who felt that they were doing well with parenting,
No.
with home education, with any aspect of it. Everyone just survived with
Yeah.
kids.
No. Yeah. It was rough. And I think that's to try and help make this relatable to anyone who's listening to this who maybe doesn't have that experience with chronic illness. That's how it can feel like all the time as a chronically ill parent, because you just don't know what you're going to wake up with, and then you've got to try and navigate that. And you know what it's like in the mornings. You don't have a lot of buffer room. You know, if I wake up and I suddenly can't walk, um, trying to arrange getting Dylan to childcare or whatever is a nightmare, because you maybe got a half-hour window to try and make that work. And my career has suffered massively since all of this has come back because of that. Because I work from home, so if I have an issue or I can't get into nursery or something like that, it's inevitably going to be me that's sort of okay. Well, I'm stuck here anyway. I'll look after it. And when it comes to navigating it, people talk a lot about pace, and it's really hard to pace. And I'm going to say that right now because people say it's nonsense, and pacing has definitely helped me. But I would also totally understand if people try to make hay while the sun shines when they have a good day and cram everything in. But by trying to level out that curve of how chronic illness can be, the ups and downs, the peaks and the troughs, has definitely helped me. So I will know to not go mad today because I feel good, to try and drag that one day of feeling good out to being maybe 2.5 days or 3 days. And I think the other thing that's really helped me is since Dylan starts talking, he's 4 now, and he's so you can't shut him up. That's all 4-year-olds are. But his empathy is like phenomenal, because I haven't hidden anything. He's seen that we've had days where he's cried on the stairs before going out to nursery, and when I've asked him what's wrong, he's like, "Oh, I don't want to leave you alone when you're in pain." Oh, it absolutely broke my heart. And you have this dilemma, you're like, should I be exposing him to all of this? But I sort of made that decision really early on that I'd rather he knows what's happening than he just sees the version of the unpredictable dad, the dad that's in pain, that is 1 minute really happy, next minute really quiet, next minute might be sort of lashing out for no reason. And I didn't want him to live in fear. So I learned that really early on with dogs and dog training. Like, they don't want you to be this human that comes in, they don't know what they're getting, sort of thing. So trying to take away those surprises, I decided really early on to be open with him. And you see it, it's really weird. Like, you see it now. Like, the other day he was crying and I said, "What's wrong?" And he said, "I want the sad to go away." And he'd obviously heard me or something. For him to say that, it proper broke me. But it then allowed us to have a conversation on his level. Well, I say, "Well, what are you feeling sad about?" And all this sort of thing. And so I think it helps, because I think if I do anything, you know, the advocacy stuff is irrelevant. No one's going to remember me when I'm gone. But if I can do anything, is if I can bring up one less man that can talk about how they're feeling, and then I feel I've done my job. That's for me, that is the priority.
Yeah.
And a lot of my advocacy sort of comes outward from that sort of thought.
Yeah, I get that. I was also really interested when you were speaking about the idea of pacing, because I know you're looking at that through the eyes of chronic illness, but actually, I think there's a lot to be said for that. I think one of the things I certainly learned during the pandemic, and I think a lot of people did, is this idea of slightly slowing down
Mhm.
and not kind of eschewing hustle culture and going at your own pace. And
Yeah.
that's something that I've, here in 2023, I'm really trying to take to heart a bit more now, is not trying to cram every single thing into one day, because none of us know what the next day brings and what obstacles we might face unexpectedly. I think there's definitely a learning from that. Kind of going back to the podcast, when did that launch, and what led to you kind of deciding I'm going to create Joel versus arthritis and grow it into this streaming empire that it is today?
Well, yeah, the podcast itself in isolation is kind of on the back burner at the minute because everything else has gone mad. But yeah, how that initially started, again, it was excuse me, during the lockdown days, trying to sort of give other people a voice. I realized, like I said earlier, there's only so much I can do sharing my story. There's only so many ways you can tell that and have an impact. So for me, I then had a decision where, okay, well, I've done that and I didn't make a dent, a difference. Or I can try and take all the skills I've learned from sharing my story and the passion I have for it, and try and get other people to do the same. And then that was the start of it. So now I describe the whole sort of suite of things, if you like, as, creating peer support spaces is what I call it. But yeah, that's initially where the podcast started. And then we had something called the Chronic Pain Club, which we now do on Twitch on Sunday evenings, where we get people to come on and talk about, and it isn't just about pain, it was just to come up with that was the initial catchy name, and it's kind of grown from there. And we've had all sorts of people on there, even people that have appeared on the Bake Off who now who come onto my Twitch channel to talk about their pain story, which just blows my mind, because 10 years ago, you would have never got people doing that. You'd have never got people, especially if they're known in the public domain. So it shows that we're breaking ground. And when I say we, I mean as a community, not me. The podcast evolved into streaming, and that takes, like I say, it's form of a talk show, but also we just provide gaming spaces. So people that use computer games as an escape, like many of us do. I know I do, for my mental health, because whilst I'm playing a computer game, I'm not worrying about that thing tomorrow or whatever. So, and there's lots of us, and there's lots of people going back to that 30, 40s age range. And we're that age. We are the original gamers, as much as we don't want to admit it.
Yeah.
We grew up in the 80s and the 90s when all that stuff kicked off. And people, it kind of started because one day I got annoyed with people thinking Twitch and Instagram was only for young people. And I thought, well, it isn't, because we were the ones who grew up. So again, it was kind of trying to create spaces where people can consume where they feel comfortable. So if they go to the podcast and listen to that while they're walking their dog, great. If they watch us on stream or hang out in a game with us, and I try to create like shared gaming spaces, then great. And they just talk in chat. If they want to watch the YouTube videos and do that, or if they want to come on the show themselves and talk and be the person in front of the camera, then brilliant. So it's about creating them layers where if people don't feel like they fit into that box, that support group that meets down the village hall, or that Facebook group that doesn't really appeal to them, or wherever that looks, it's kind of trying to think differently. And I think everything I've done so far is kind of around that idea of like, where can I create a space where people will feel comfortable to get peer support that doesn't sort of already exist.
Has it helped you along your journey as well, being part of that?
Yeah, I quite openly sort of say to people, like, I'm really selfish because this is my therapy. It just is. And I talk a lot about, continuing to do what you love even when you're not well. So like, we're kind of programmed as a society where you get sick, you must stop everything. And it goes back to when you were kids and your parents would say, well, no, if you're not well enough to go to school, then you're not well enough to play on a computer or whatever. I sort of advocate quite a lot for, if you're off sick, carry on doing what keeps you well if you're able. And for me, it's writing and having conversations. I will be torn up inside of my guilt if I'm off work or if I'm signed off work because of my chronic illness, and I'm still talking to people on Twitch or doing something like this conversation today. But for me, it's my therapy. It keeps me well. If I stop doing that, I spiral really quickly, because there's part of it that's me talking about my situation, but creating those spaces for other people to do the same just brings me fulfillment in a way that I never really knew I could get when I was younger, until I sort of discovered all of this. So yeah, it's selfish.
Curious as well, because I know when I struggled with depression, particularly during parts of pandemic and pre-pandemic, one of the things I did was bring that home a lot and talk about it a lot to my wife, and that wasn't easy for anyone. I mean, does having this space somewhat alleviate the pressure in terms of married life as well?
Yeah, totally. And don't get me wrong, my poor wife doesn't get off that easy, because she moderates on the Twitch channel, she moderates on our Discord server, she moderates the Facebook support group. So there's more jobs that keep going her way. But what it does allow me to do is that, we all have different support networks, and it's really important for people to understand what their support network is and what form it takes. For some people, it's family. For some people, it's who's in the house. For some people, it's their football team or whatever. For me, I don't have a massive support network, and that's because of everything I lost in that 2019 scenario. I went from playing rugby every weekend with 15 to 18 guys, and that was my support network. And then I suddenly became a totally different person, and I was too ashamed to tell them what was going on. So I just vanished, and lost touch and everything else. And then all of a sudden it puts you in a house, and the only person you've got to turn to is a toddler or your poor long-suffering wife. And that isn't healthy. For me, it absolutely does help with that. And I would encourage anyone else to try it as well, because we'll get people come in our support groups of various forms, and they'll say, oh, my parents are brilliant, they're my support network, my wife's brilliant, they're my support network. But there's two issues. One, as the patient, we're always worried about the burden we're putting on those around us. And there's no, going back to how the system doesn't work to support chronic illness, there's no facilitating that. You know, no doctor, you don't walk into your doctor and they ask you, what's your support network look like? Or how's your illness affecting those around you? They're never going to ask those two questions. They should, but they don't. So there's that element of it. But there's also, I think people don't appreciate how much help they can get, non-medicinal help, just from talking to people who get it. My wife is an absolute expert in all this because she's heard me do these things a million times now, but she will never know what it feels like to have that pain, or to wake up that morning with the unknown, or to not know what tomorrow looks like, or to mourn all the things we've lost with chronic illness because our life just keeps shifting at a moment's notice. And until you speak to other people that have that lived experience, you don't realize how much of that burden you can unload on people that are willing to accept it. So yeah, if you're not already, get involved with peer support, because mental health, physical health, doesn't matter what, the benefits are huge for me personally anyway.
I know you've also talked about kind of revisiting talking therapies and CBT during the middle of the pandemic. I mean, how did that help you to kind of psychologically deal with this pain you're experiencing on a daily basis?
Yeah, like massively. I'm not ashamed to say that I was very stereotypical sort of British male going into my long-term pain thing. You know, I was used to the arthritis coming and going, the psoriasis coming and going. But, you know, normally it was a case of I could just like hide it, carry on. And as I say, with my rugby team, that was kind of the method I took, thinking, oh, I'll be back in a couple of months. So then suddenly when it doesn't get better, you realize that approach is very short term and doesn't work, and also isn't healthy, because, you know, it proper depresses me to think how many real strong friendships I've had over the years that I've completely torched because I wasn't comfortable talking about what I was living with, and how basically these two people depend on what my health condition is doing. I had some talk therapies in my mid-20s, but I don't think it had the same effect. The weight, I wasn't a parent then, this sort of thing. But yeah, doing that changed everything. And it kind of took me from writing for myself to talking outwardly, which then started this whole gel versus arthritis snowball thing off. And now I get yearly CBT. For me, how it helped, I now recognize the science. I can't necessarily help my low mood, depression, or mental health wobbles, because if I wake up in a high pain day, I'd challenge anyone to be bright as a button. You're just not going to be. But what it's done is equipped me with the tools to one, recognize when I'm struggling, recognize when I need help or I need to put my hand up for help, but also just manage it a lot better. And that combined with pain management therapy, which again is like not about what pills you're taking, it's about, you know, distractions and living with it, and working with your pain, and also a little bit of acceptance. A lot of people are very reluctant, and my word, have I faced some resistance on this topic over the years. Some people just, again, it goes back being thinking someone's going to fix it for me, there's got to be a cure. People don't want to hear, well, actually there might not be, and you've got to learn to live with it, and there isn't a magic bullet coming to save you. And pain management was really good, pain management talking therapy, for that. So much so that I now volunteer for them to try and convince new people coming into the service to say, stick with it. I know it's going to feel really weird, and your brain is going to tell you to laugh and run at it, and it isn't going to work, but it does, and you've got to stick with it. And that was like this 9-week really intensive talking therapy. But it does work. But it's about rewiring your brain, because everything internally tells you there'll be a fix, there's got to be a fix. And once you start accepting it and living with it, you can start living with it. Essentially, you know.
And a lot of what you're talking about here is obviously being, you know, part of a community, isn't it? And kind of really owning where you are. And amongst all these other things you're doing, the podcast and the international speaking and your writing, everything else, you've also founded this ethical clothing brand in the Pain Company. So what led you to starting up your own clothing business, and what's been the impact of that so far?
That one was I should have some really like inspirational story here where I talk about I was walking along one day and this thing, but no, it was complete like peer pressure and seeing there was this need. So going back, and I'm sorry for anyone who doesn't, I feel like I've mentioned the pandemic far too much, but it's where all this stuff happened. You had this growing community of people that were starting to wear this stuff on their sleeves that had never happened before, and I realized there was just this window where if we didn't jump on this now, everyone was going to go back in their box. And like I sort of mentioned earlier on, that kind of has happened to a certain extent, with lots of accounts being closed or people going back to sort of normal life. And there was a group of us that were like, you know, I'm proud, I want to make it cool, like, you know, like with my roots in sort of music and bands and tattoo art and things like that, I kind of wanted to do something that allowed people to express it. So if they weren't ready to share their story, they could maybe use it as a starting point, So a lot of what I talk about is saying to people, don't tell me how to fix what I'm living with. Ask me what I need. And for some people, they felt more comfortable wearing a t-shirt that just had the word pain on in some shape or form. Because if somebody asked about it, it kind of gave them an outlet to then talk about what they were dealing with. So that's where it came from. And then we sort of decided to stick to the sort of organic, cotton, ethical route, everything's printed in a green factory, all this sort of thing, because it kind of just felt right with what we were campaigning for. We're trying to make the world a better place for people with chronic illness. Why not try and do that ethically as well? So that was how that all started. I was doing campaigns alongside it as well. So the idea was every range or sort of line that we had would be associated with a campaign. So we'd done like constantly talking about pain in every January for a couple of years, and we'd done like kids live with pain too, sort of thing. So we've got some stuff coming for the year. But yeah, I must admit, with the cost of living crisis and everything else that's been going on, particularly here in the UK over Christmas and January, I haven't pushed that on anyone at all. But it's still there. I'm still really proud of it. I do all the designs myself, which, scratches that creative itch for me. And hopefully there's still people out there feeling like it gives them an opportunity to sort of wear something that visualizes what they feel or allows them to start a conversation. Because ultimately everything I do with my advocacy is about starting conversations, and that sort of followed the same theme.
Yeah, right. I mean, they're awesome designs. I'll drop some notes in the show notes in terms of how to buy them and have a look. But yeah, I'd encourage everyone to have a look and to kind of get on board with Joel's message here. One thing that jumped out to me when you were talking earlier was kind of going into your shell during the pandemic and kind of struggling to come out of that a little bit in social situations. Yet the juxtaposition of that is that you've been speaking in front of hundreds, if not thousands of people on a podium. What's that been like as someone who's become, a little bit by her own admission reclusive? How have you balanced that with becoming an international speaker?
That was, I think, if it would have been any other subject, I think it probably shows you my passion for what I do and how advocacy has kind of consumed everything now, and it's become a more of my sort of like full-time focus. Because any other subject would have never got me on a plane going anywhere this year or last year, sorry. That all kind of snowballed in that I'd been asked to speak at the IFPA forum in Italy, and I'm an IFPA ambassador. IFPA are like the global association for psoriasis patient organizations. So they've got tens of members around the world. And I'm really proud to be the UK ambassador for that. Like it's literally it might sound silly with everything else I've done, but that is like my highest achievement for me, because to get to work on that level outside of the UK, it just blows my mind, and I still pinch myself every day about that. But
That's amazing.
To be able to reach more people ultimately with the message is the goal. So yeah, they invited me out there, and then all of a sudden, over about a 3-week period, my emails just went crazy of people hearing, "Oh, I hear you're in Italy. Do you want to stay on and do this? And do you want to stay on?" And what went from me being like a 2-day trip to do a talk and come home turned into 3 talks and 2 live streams. And then eventually the trip in Spain a few weeks later to do the documentary. Just bizarre. And the feedback I had was crazy. And yeah, if you had said to me a year ago, you'll be sitting at, one of the places I talked was the EADV conference, which is a real medical heavy, like proper, like they turn the nose up for patients there. What are you doing here? Very, very highbrow kind of medical community conference. And I'm not exaggerating, standing room only. It was like people queuing out the back, and we were doing this sort of like patient doctor role play consultation thing, and we proper hit the mark. We had a real massive response to that, and it led on to other things for me to do. So I think, yeah, the important point with that is like, don't get me wrong, I was terrified. I rang my wife numerous times in tears. I'm not ashamed to admit it. There was one bit where, because when we were doing the IFPA forum at the start of the weekend, I was with all my other ambassadors that I know really well, and it felt like a family. Then I had to move on to the other talks, and I found myself in another hotel in the middle of Italy with no friends, and I had a massive wobble. I didn't know how I was getting out of the hotel to get on the plane home, let alone to go and do the next talk. Yeah, so my poor wife talked me through that one. Let's say, going back to the imposter syndrome and pandemic effect and everything. I'm really proud to say that it felt like the making of me. It kind of showed a mirror to myself of what I was capable of. So up until that point, I get lots of DMs from people across socials and everything else about bits of writing I put out, or the podcast, or quotes, or whatever it might be. And I don't know, there was this big part of me that just kind of just didn't acknowledge them. Not because I was ignorant or arrogant, or I couldn't believe it. I could, the feedback that was coming, I just couldn't connect it in my brain, because for me I was just this guy moaning about his condition. and then something magical happened in that week in Italy with the talks and the streams and everything, that just kind of said, I don't know, it just confirmed to me. It's like I woke up to what I was capable of and what I can do with all of this. I don't depend on your viewpoint. That was the worst or the best thing that could happen to me, because now I feel like I'm just a wrecking ball of like, I'm gonna get messages across, and I'm gonna allow other people to share their stories, and I'm gonna get everything's just, I'm thinking bigger. So when it was just I would do a Twitch stream and I was basically talking to a couple of friends or whatever. Now it's like, no, we're going to launch this new massive Minecraft server and we're going to have hundreds of people playing on it, and they're all going to be talking about their shared experiences. And yeah, it was a proper life changing moment generally. And I cried lots that week, good and bad tears. And but I definitely come back an improved person for it. Still very much terrified of going out socializing with friends, which sounds absolutely ridiculous when you think of what I did. But I think it just goes to show that when you have a passion for something and you can find yourself doing it for fun, then you can kind of achieve anything on those lines.
And just imagine if your 2019 self had seen your 2022 self, and how far you've come on your journey in 3 years. It's incredible, and you should feel really proud of it, because that's an amazing achievement you've made, and it kind of shows just the power of having a voice and being consistent with that voice. I think that's what I've heard from our conversation tonight, is you're not just someone who's moaned relentlessly about the challenges. You've looked at the positives, you looked at what can be done about it, you've advocated for change, and it just shows that power of continuing with the same message over and over again until you're heard, and uniting people. The one question I want to kind of leave us with tonight is probably the trickiest one, Joel. But if there's anyone who's listening or watching today that has just received a diagnosis themselves, or indeed has a friend or family member who has, is there any advice that you give? And I guess, having lived through this for your life now, is there any knowledge that you possess now that you wish you'd had in your personal arsenal years back?
Yeah, I think for me the main message would be, it won't feel like it right now, but there is others out there that understand, and there is support, and we've come a long way with that. I used to be a kid in a waiting room full of old people with posters on the wall full of old people, given leaflets full of old people, and I felt completely misrepresented and not understood. A lot of that has changed, and it's changing every single day. So although you will feel like the only one in the world right now if you're getting that news, or you'll be feeling like sometimes it can feel like a death sentence, even though it's not, it's far from it. One, give yourself time to process that. Two, there is support out there. Three, like we've touched upon tonight, understand what your support network is, and that can take any form. It doesn't need to be an immediate family member. Sometimes it can be a complete stranger on the internet, or your boss at work, or whatever whatever form that takes. And then I say, start talking and just start a conversation. It doesn't need to be, forget all the stuff I'm doing and all the levels below that. It can be as simple as just reaching out to one person and having that conversation. And I think the one thing, and anyone who's heard me talk before would have heard this, but I'm going to keep banging on about it because it can't be said enough. Just say to somebody, don't suggest, don't try and tell me fix, don't tell me yoga or my diet or some snake oil is going to fix everything. Just ask me what I need today, because it's variable, it's fluid, every day is different. Today I might need physical support, tomorrow I might need mental support. So get into that habit of getting those people around you, that support network, to ask what you need today. And then that is your opening. If you don't want to talk, you don't have to. But if you do want to talk, that is your opening then to say what it is you might need. And that might just be somebody pop to the shops for you, or coming around to have a cup of tea with you, or something much more serious. But it gives you that opening without the pressure of feeling like you've got to go out and make it happen. So that'd be my suggestion is, start conversations. It'll feel really isolating, but don't allow it to isolate you, because the default the little ape in your brain, or however way you want to phrase it, will tell you to just shut out the world, and especially if something is physically noticeable as psoriasis. But yeah, don't fight that as much as you can.
And are there any resources that or organisations out there that you'd recommend people towards for more information?
Yeah, so if you're in the UK, the Psoriasis Association are phenomenal, particularly on the skin side. So they're brilliant. If you struggle more with something like psoriatic arthritis and the pain and everything is more of a problem, then you've got your Versus Arthritises in the UK. Internationally, like I say, IFBA, of course I'm going to say IFBA, I'm an IFBA ambassador, but check their website out, because that can signpost you to other places. And then again, of course, I'm going to end by saying that peer support, it's what I do. We fill that gap. Charities are brilliant at raising the big issues to policymakers, decision makers, government, and they're great at offering telephone support lines and funding research. But I still genuinely believe, and not everybody agrees with me, but I still genuinely believe that there is a massive gap for patient to patient peer support. And there's loads out there. Don't join the first Facebook group you find where it's basically people trying to shout down who's the worst off or wearing badges of honor. Go out and find the community that works for you. And if that's face to face, if that's virtual, whatever, just don't settle, because there is so many options out there. And if you find something that doesn't work for you, tell people like me and we'll create it. That's what we exist for. But so yeah, between patient organizations and peer support, we can hopefully fill the gap that you have between, and it can feel like a very long gap between medical appointments. And hopefully, you're the only one that will live with it 24/7. Your doctors never will. So people like us and patient organizations have to try and fill that gap for you.
And in terms of the community you've created, how can our listeners kind of keep in touch with you after the show?
Yes, so if you go to, you can go to my website, it's joelnelson.uk, which all the links are on there, or you can find me on social media at Joel versus Arthritis, that's VS Arthritis. You can find us on Twitch at Joel versus Arthritis, the podcast is Joel versus Arthritis. But we talk about a lot more, as you've probably realised from tonight, and it's more, chronic illness in general, mental health, parenting, everything in between. So yeah, if live TV is kind of your thing, then you can check us out on Twitch. If podcast your thing there, but yeah, just Google Joel versus Arthritis and you might find something out there on the interwebs.
Well, thank you so much, Joel, for coming on today. But you and I are going to go for a very, very long overdue beer together.
Yes, very long.
lot to catch up on. But this podcast, I set up this podcast to talk and connect, and in some instances like tonight, reconnect with people who inspire me and who've lived inspiring lives. And I don't think many people have inspired me more than you in recent years. And I'm so pleased to see you, looking so healthy, sounding so healthy, and doing such amazing work to support others. So, keep at it, keep being open, keep in conversation. And thank you very much, Joel, for coming on today.
Thank you ever so much for having me, Ben, and for the lovely words. It means a lot. Cheers.
So that's it for today. Thanks to my brilliant guest, Joel Nelson, for this conversation. Please do check out Joel's hugely inspiring podcast, Joel vs. Arthritis, and do keep in touch with Joel via social media. And if you've enjoyed today's show, and if you feel others could benefit from the conversation, then don't forget to share it on and let us know what you think via the hashtag GoodJourneysPod. All past episodes of our podcast are available now via our website, secondmountaincoms.co.uk/podcast. And we're on Spotify, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Amazon Music, and everywhere else that podcasts are available. So that's it for another episode. Thank you so much for joining us today. This has been the Good Journeys with Second Mountain podcast. So until next time, let's keep climbing together, and I'll see you all again soon.